LinkedIn presents.
Is your employer supportive and taking action when it comes to mental health? I'm Maura Aarons-Mele, and this is The Anxious Achiever, the show that looks at the intersection of mental health and work and asks, how can we do both better?
Will AI improve our lives or exterminate the species? What would it take to abolish poverty? Are you eating enough fermented foods? These are some of the questions we've tackled recently on The Next Big Idea. I'm Rufus Griscom, and every week I sit down with the world's leading thinkers for in-depth conversations that will help you live, work, and play smarter. Follow The Next Big Idea wherever you get your podcasts.
My guest today has something in common with a lot of us. He did an about-face to really focus his career full-time on mental wellness and health in the wake of his own mental health crisis experience. Previously, he worked at an elite consulting company, a place where, as we know, people with anxiety tend to thrive, at least professionally. They also tend to burn out. In the case of Vlad Gheorghiu, now CEO at Kyan Heath, working at a fast-paced job like that helped to be the catalyst for panic and anxiety attacks. And he took a step back and saw that even with well-meaning managers and companies, there just wasn't enough being done. So he started Kyan Heath. And the thing that I think is really cool about Kyan is that it's an end-to-end solution. So it helps employees address their individual mental health, but it connects the dots to how individual mental health ladders up to how an organization performs. We all know that we work in systems. And so anxiety, for example, exists within a system. Treating one person can make a difference. Treating a team or understanding how mental health affects your organization can really create catalytic change. Kyan looks at what companies can be doing ahead of time to improve worker mental health. And yes, even how it affects their bottom line. Before Kyan, your company, you worked at McKinsey, which is the famous, controversial, but very, very elite consulting company. In my work with leaders and high performers, these kinds of places tend to attract people who thrive on anxiety, right? You know, there's even been research that companies like this exploit our anxiety to get us to work harder when we're at them. I'm curious if that resonated with your own experience. And what do you think, looking back, is the problem with that system?
So I'm not sure I would use the word exploit, but there's definitely this recurring theme that you'd hear with McKinsey and also, my friends from other consulting companies about the insecure overachiever. There's a certain type of person that tends to want to apply and, get into these types of jobs. They tend to be people who push themselves through, elite universities, and before that, had the highest grades in high schools. And those are really the type of people that are selected to join these type of environments. And I think the selection process is designed in a certain way to, identify people who will push themselves, sometimes beyond their limits to deliver whatever is set in front of them, be it a, due diligence project with very long hours or a massive transformation for a client with, equally challenging circumstances. And I think for a very short period in the beginning of anyone's career, that type of environment can be extremely challenging, but also, conducive to learning.
Exhilarating, right?
Exhilarating, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like being high on, this sort of, high performance myth. I think the challenge with that is, when we don't learn to manage the level of pressure, and also when we don't learn to actively recover and take breaks, right? And I think that's why burnout is extremely common in these environments, not just in consulting, definitely not just in McKinsey, but really in all these very, very high pressure, high performance environments. And I think the challenge to this point is learning when to take breaks, when to give people time to recover, when to, re-energize so they can come back stronger. Right. And because otherwise you tend to lose, the very best people that you spent so much money on recruiting and training. And of course, nobody wants that.
You obviously don't work at McKinsey anymore. Why not?
I spent almost 9 years in McKinsey, and I would argue that's, probably a lot longer than the average. I don't know what the latest, average tenure is, but, when I started, it was about 3 years. And I think there's a certain natural growth that happens after spending so long in McKinsey, right? Out of my 9 years there, 8 years, I found it to be an exceptional environment for me, right? I stayed there as long as I felt I could keep learning and develop and go in a certain, direction that I wanted to go into. But then in 2019, 2020, I really started struggling with anxiety, with depression. I also learned a lot about burnout at the time. And that's when I started asking myself a lot of the questions that I had been, avoiding for a long time. Is this the right environment for me? Do I get a real sense of purpose and meaning out of my, everyday work? And it's also when I started to think about other opportunities and, about the topic of mental health in general and how do we deal with mental health at work. And, I had to take some time off because I was struggling up to a point where I wasn't any longer very effective. I was dealing with panic attacks on a regular basis. And I remember very clearly one night I think it was January 2020, when I was lying on the floor of my apartment in Singapore at the time. I was there for an assignment. And I literally thought I was having a heart attack. I think I was 30 at the time. Happily, it wasn't a heart attack. It was a very intense panic attack. But I remember thinking, how am I going to be able to, be in Indonesia the next day for this workshop if I'm having a heart attack now? And then, after, taking a bit of time to calm down, I was sort of analyzing that thought. It's like, why is this the first thought that came to my mind, right? Like, forget the
Right.
workshop.
Not,
right?
am I dying?
Exactly. Like, forget the workshop, right? Like somebody, we'll figure the workshop out. It became quite clear that I needed to change a few things. But I was really afraid to confront, anyone else with this topic, right? I was, all of a sudden dealing with this thing that I didn't know exactly how to put into words. So I called a senior partner who was, also working on this project and somebody I felt quite close to. And I was expecting a bit of, this sort of standoffish response, like, well, that's a personal thing, but we still need to get the work done. And I actually received exactly the opposite response. This person opened up about their own struggles, and his immediate reaction was like, this is time for you to disconnect and look after yourself and, find your way to being, yourself again. And if that means being productive and happy, then great, right? But really right now you should focus on yourself. And I guess that's the first time in my career, right? Remember, it had been already 8.5 years working in consulting where I kind of felt that I could step off the gas pedal for a little bit and just look into these deeper questions that I had been neglecting for quite a bit. And of course, that also opened up the question of what else would I want to do? You asked me why no longer. I think it's after this experience, I started questioning a lot more. And I also became really passionate about the way we deal with mental health at work.
Yes, I mean, I really want to get into that because one of the things I find really interesting about your company is that you kind of go there with like, what about the system at work is actually making this worse? And I think that's really important. But my question, you said that, this forced you to confront things that you said you had been sort of not dealing with or putting off. I'm curious if looking back, the sort of anxiety and the mental health challenges were there and you could manage to keep them below the surface or put them into your work. Like what's looking back, what's your theory on why it all came to a head?
Yeah, man, I think, maybe the consultant in me wants to use a framework here.
No PowerPoint, please.
No PowerPoint, I swear. But, burnout is really sort of, exhaustion, like physical, mental exhaustion. There's also lack of perceived professional efficacy. And I think for me, I was constantly exhausted, but 99.999% I was also extremely effective, right? And there was all of this positive reinforcement that kept coming in from clients, from managers, from partners, and so on, that, despite being exhausted every day, you're sort of the best, right? I didn't realize it at the time, but that also meant that I was really dependent on this external feedback of my performance to keep going. Because, if all the other sort of things were empty, that was the only cup that kept me going. And it was enough to have one negative discussion with one person, from our team to really make me question and challenge everything and to really make me extremely anxious, despite, all of the clients being really happy, despite everything else actually, still going well. One small discussion, was enough to trigger this. I think for me that was also pretty eye-opening, that I can't, be so sensitive, right? In
So
previous,
fragile.
exactly. I
Yeah.
wanted to talk about that because in previous editions of this podcast, you talk about being anti-fragile, right? That made me realize how fragile I really was, and how I can become a little bit more, anti-fragile in that sense.
Well, when you're an anxious achiever and you're living for the adulation and the praise and the achievement, if something pierces that armor, it's really wounding.
Correct. And one thing in hindsight, at the time, the things that could, push me to have a massive panic attack was an unhappy client or, an unhappy senior partner for whatever reason. And now, we manage a big team. We have so many, large investors. We have hundreds of thousands of people who are using our services daily. But I'm less anxious that things might go wrong, despite having so much more responsibility, right? So it kind of puts things in context of, the things that can make you fragile if you let them, versus the things that can actually give you confidence, if you give space for that.
What do you think it was also about this senior partner, obviously someone that you respected, who had a lot of social capital in the organization, sort of giving you permission to stop, that worked for you?
So we're going to go a little bit deep here. My mom is a psychiatrist, and, I always felt like I could really open up to her and, address a lot of the topics that held me back. Also going back to, maybe, why I wasn't able to ask some of these questions. But my dad was always the person who pushed me to go further, be more, perform better than I thought I could, right? So in some way, it was always the voice of my father that was in the back of my mind around, pushing more, working longer, delivering certain things, which is for a while was very good. It helped me perform great in university, get great jobs, do very well in my jobs and so on. But it also made that I could never take the foot off the gas pedal, right? And I just assumed that whenever somebody was in a position of authority, they would take the role of my father in the sense of, always pushing more, always sort of, giving more sometimes than I could. And this was probably the first person that I encountered in my career who had that, position of power, but actually guided me in a different direction, in a direction of recovery and self-care, right? And, maybe 2 days, I think, after the panic attack where I decided to, take some time off, I actually called my father. And I told him, hey, look, this is what happened. I think I need to take some time off now to look after myself. And he actually said, of course, no, this is actually happening a little bit late. You really should have tried to do that before. And I'm really sad that, it got to this point, right? So again, totally the opposite answer than, versus the one that I had expected. I also realized I built up, this sort of, extreme pressure myself, right? It's on a sort of outdated tape that I had playing in the back of my mind from, when I was sort of doing, math exams or whatever, when I was much, much younger.
Let's talk about your company. Let's talk about why, right? You've said that companies protect physical health well, but not so much mental health. I'm curious, how do you see public sector, private sector, individual responsibility all coming together, and where does Kyan fit into that? We look in the US especially, we always think of mental health, and it is as a public health issue. And I feel like often the workplace gets away with a lot because we're so focused on either the public health aspects or the individual, just fix it yourself, right? Meditate.
Yeah. And I think we need to start by recognizing that, mental health is health. There's no, distinct sort of separation, I would hope, between physical and mental health. But unfortunately, this invisible part of health, behavioral mental health, is much harder to tackle than it is to, give people benefits for back pain, right? Or let people go when they have a broken arm. It's visible, it's clear. We don't talk about responsibility when, somebody gets injured in an accident, right? They obviously just get the support they need. It starts with recognizing that it's harder to deal with the invisible part because there's always this element of responsibility, right? Whose responsibility is it to look after people's mental health? And that was a barrier we hit on very early on when we first started speaking with CHROs. And most of our clients are in Europe. So the level of understanding of this topic is, to a certain extent, lower than it is in the US because we just started talking about this, during the pandemic pretty much, right? So we got asked a lot, hey, but what is the employer's responsibility to address mental health at work? And that's a really tough question to answer. So we actually prefer to think in terms of interest rather than responsibility. If I'm a manager of my team, my interest is that we deliver, whatever project and topic we work on. And the way I do that is by making sure, everybody in my team is at their best. And they're going to deliver really good work. And that means they can be focused, they are clear on what they need to do, and they have the energy and will and competence to deliver these things. And feeling good is a huge part of that, right? So it doesn't make too much sense to debate whether or not it's the manager's responsibility to manage their team's mental health, but it's definitely in their interest for the team to be performing well. And that's when we realized that, you could bring this aspect into the workplace of mental health as a source of sustainable high performance over time, right? That's when we stop having this push-pull relationship between, hey, I want you to invest in resources that support people's mental health. Oh no, but they actually have a health insurance who covers them in case they are depressed. And going into the direction of, hey, I want my team to be performing super well. So I'm going to, create the environment where they can do that. The second thing that we noticed is it's not enough to just focus on individuals. And actually, I noticed this when I was leading the mental health program at McKinsey for a while as well. And we had just released a ton of resources, meditation apps, employee assistance programs. And we saw a big uptake the first 3 weeks. And then, over time, really very poor retention. And, it made me ask why. And one of the things, we noticed is you can't really tackle mental health by just focusing on the individual because there's a lot of contextual elements at work, right? You can't really solve exhaustion through therapy if people are working 16-hour days without taking breaks, right? They don't even have time for therapy. So then we realized, well, there's definitely an element of organizational health that needs to be prioritized as well. And that can only happen when you have access to data. If not, it will always be swept under the rug, right? So what we noticed in both public health and with, sort of private enterprise is that unless you create a very compelling data set for companies to act on, they won't. And they just keep pushing things on the individual, right? And which, ultimately leads to the same outcome, which is, people don't perform at their best and they fall sick. And then there's this back and forth on whose responsibility it is.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the whole point of interest, I talk a lot about athletes, right? And how athletes who must perform at such an elite level, they must take care of themselves. It's not an option. They have to rest. They have to recover. They have to tend to their well-being. Otherwise, they won't, win championships. But at work, it's easier to just ignore and just say, keep going.
That's such a powerful example. And, one of our clients is On, the sportswear brand from Switzerland.
I love On Running. Yeah.
They're amazing. And, they really took this concept to heart. They actually built a program called Build a Better You, which was inspired by athletes. And what they said is, athletes invest actively in both their physical and mental performance, right? And they do a lot of training on that. They build the skill of managing their mental well-being. So we want to learn from them and bring the athlete spirit into the workplace. And that's where they offered Kyan Health to all of their people globally. But then they actually noticed that there was so much engagement with Kyan within their office staff that they went back and said, what if we offered Kyan to our athletes too? So now we support a lot of the On athletes that went to the Olympics in Paris last year. And, we're actively, empowering athletes to manage the mental health as well, which is, very challenging for them too. And we've seen a lot of examples of that recently.
That's cool. Any athlete stories or anecdotes you want to share?
Actually, we had one, Nikola Spirig, who's, I think, probably the Hall of Famer triathlete of the world, definitely of Switzerland, who opened up our Swiss Wellbeing Summit in 2022. We organized a meeting of well-being leaders in Switzerland, and it was hosted by On that year. And her story really resonated with everybody in the room because she talked about moments of real difficulty, like real setbacks, injury, and then coming back from that and winning, an Olympic triathlon event. And how important her relationship with her coach was for that, to build confidence again, to build her ability to, push through while still, recovering from injury. So still managing that health part as well. And I think the parallel between overcoming setbacks in the sports world work very well with how people overcome setbacks in the working world.
How does your data support that healing, or does it? Or
well, unfortunately, we have less data on individual health and well-being than athletes do because they track everything. Right? Like they have all of these tools nowadays. What our data shows is that we correlate well-being numbers, well-being metrics with percentage probability of voluntary attrition, meaning people leave the company for mental health reasons, for example, and with the likelihood of going to a long-term disability leave. Right? And what we see is that when people are actively managing their well-being, be it through a relationship with a coach, be it through regular meditation practice, being through therapy in some cases, their probability of going on a long-term sick leave reduces significantly. The probability of leaving their employer for a mental health related reason also reduces significantly, right? And we actually ran a case study with On again, where over a period of, I think it was 12 to 18 months, we saw a significant reduction in both absenteeism and voluntary attrition related to mental health, which I think it was almost a 10x return on their investment with us. So we definitely see there's an impact. And when companies really track this data, it makes a huge difference.
Hey you, I'm Andrew Seaman. Do you want a new job? Or do you want to move forward in your career? Well, you should listen to my weekly show called Get Hired with Andrew Seaman. We talk about it all, and it's waiting for you, yes you, wherever you get your podcasts.
From the minds of visionaries to the desks of disruptors, I'm Lars Schmidt, host of the Redefining Work podcast. Join me each week as we explore the new world of work through the lens of those shaping it. CEOs, HR leaders, investors, and more. Be a part of the conversation that changes everything. Subscribe to Redefining Work today.
here's what I don't understand. We know, and we've known for years, that mental ill-being is the number one reason why employees miss work. We know that. We know it. In the US, it's so trend-driven. It's so circumstantial when companies decide to actually take this seriously and when they don't. I don't understand what the missing piece is, and I'm curious how Kyan can solve that.
Yeah.
Certainly in the US, where, if we have a bad stock market cycle, everything on well-being just ends. It just pulls back. We're seeing it right now. Everyone in my field right now, they're like, what the heck happened? Everyone during the pandemic, all they could talk about was this, and now there's no budgets for anything.
Yeah. I fully resonate with that. We've been selling health and well-being to companies over 2022, 2023, 2024. It's been tough, right? Because a lot of the conversation comes back to show me the money. And it's difficult to show the money when you do this bottom-up studies. And to a certain extent, because data is private, confidential, siloed, insurance don't share reasons for going on sick leave and so on. It's very hard to make an extremely robust case study where you can show an ROI, right? So this bottom-up approach that a CFO of a bank would want to see is pretty tricky to build, and it's also prone to challenge because you have to use some assumptions. What I found as the most compelling argument is research that came from Oxford Wellbeing Research Center recently. Professor Jan Deneuve, he actually presented it, I think, a couple of months back, where they looked at the return on investment of prioritizing mental health through a bottom-up approach. So what they did is they took $1,000 and maybe taking a step back, they've created the largest data set of well-being in the world in partnership with Oxford Wellbeing Research Center and Indeed, the job search portal. And in that, they created an index of the top 100 performing companies on the topic of health and well-being. And they said, well, what would happen if we took $1,000 and we just invested in January 2021 in these companies, then we rebalance the portfolio again and see who comes out in this 100 index in 2022, 2023. And long story short, what the research showed is that in a boom, positive economic cycle, the companies who invest in health and well-being come out on top. They perform significantly better than the S&P 500, for example. However, and that's the interesting insight, in a downturn, they're also a lot more resilient than the S&P 500. So what that showed me is not only should you invest in health and well-being when things go well and you want to attract the best talent, if you keep investing in these topics, if you keep managing your health and well-being, if you keep creating a safe environment for your people in a downturn, then you also see the benefit, right? So I think that research really challenged this idea that, health and well-being should be the first budget to be cut, and really smart clients don't cut that. And I can tell you, we've never lost a corporate client because they know that, right? We're not a cheap solution. We're definitely not the cheapest provider in this area, but the companies that work with us know the value of well-being, and therefore they, kept investing despite the, economic cycle.
That's really powerful. And coming full circle to where we started, I think what we see all too often is when things get tight and scary, too many companies just resort to fear and anxiety monitoring, which then becomes contagious, right? I was at a large social media platform a few weeks ago, and it was so full, and this is an office that's been a ghost town for a while. And someone joked, well, yeah, there's been a lot of layoffs, so everyone's in the office, right? It's, and you're like, yeah, I get it. But we're so used to fear driving behavior.
100%. And look, despite all this fact-based, despite, the research that's coming out, ultimately these decisions are made, in a boardroom in front of an Excel sheet by a CFO and a CEO who's under a ton of, and a CHRO and so on, was under a ton of pressure from their investors. And when you look at an Excel sheet, it's very difficult to, make the case for keeping, and investing in well-being, which is why, we need forward-thinking leaders. We need leaders who have themselves maybe gone through challenging moments in their career, and they've done enough soul searching and learning to see that, you need to sustain high performance through the economic cycles and not just when things go well, right? And despite the ups and downs that the economy goes through, I think more leaders have done that searching, and this topic is becoming a little bit more ingrained in our, in our culture.
I agree. There's so many of us out there. I want to just transition a little bit into AI and how you use AI in tech as we round out. But first, pretend that I'm a client. Why should I work with you?
A lot of our clients have tried different things. Almost 90% of companies offer some type of mental health and well-being solution, right?
Okay. So these are companies that are forward-thinking, investing in talent.
We typically try to, let's say, you're obviously passionate about this topic. You've looked into this. Oftentimes our clients come to us because they've tried different things and it didn't work. What they see is 90% of, people don't use any of these solutions, right? And it's also quite confusing. They've tried coaching, they've tried meditation, they've tried CBT, and they have all of these hundreds of resources, and it's become a little bit of a, salad of things, and they don't really know how to get it exciting and get their people to use these tools. So we often get brought in as sort of the glue that can create a cohesive health and well-being strategy that really, really makes people want to use it. So we offer basically the opportunity to create a single global program that's culturally relevant for somebody in Japan, somebody in Poland, somebody in the US, and that also offers data for a health and well-being leader to switch on the light, to really keep their finger on the pulse on what's really going on throughout their entire company, right? So the way this works, there's what we call Kyan Care, which is the individual level solution. We have mobile apps, web portals, phone lines, and so on, that anyone anywhere in the world can use, right? And so the first thing we remove is this question of, okay, I'm feeling a bit anxious. What should I use? Should I call the EAP? Do I go on the well-being portal? What do I use? We use AI as a care navigator. And based on an initial assessment that people complete, it leads people through the specific resources that are proven to help other people with a similar context, right? And it does it in a sort of caring, compassionate way where you also build a relationship with already this AI.
Are you an AI layer on top of this, or are you actually sourcing therapists, coaches, counselors as part of your company?
Yeah, no. So we have a global network of coaches, counselors, which we manage directly. The AI is the front end. So it's the door opener, right? And we see more than 50% of people who use therapy or coaching with one of our counselors have never done that before. So it was always a black box for them. They're like, well, I've heard other people use it, but I don't know if I find the right person. And what do I say? Is it going to be embarrassing? What if they judge me, right? All of those questions. So because when they begin their journey, they've already exchanged a little bit with Kai, which is our Kyan AI. They kind of got a feel for how this type of interactions could feel. And we then, once we identify the topic that the person wants to work on, we proactively match them with a coach or a psychologist so they can move on to that next step if they want, right? And our goal is never to replace the therapist or never to, provide sort of, full AI therapy. I think we're very far from that. But it is to bring the right care to the people who need it when they need it. And that often comes with creating awareness when you don't know what's really going on, right? And the AI can be super helpful for that. But then, it doesn't just stop there. As I mentioned, you can have unlimited therapy. And if you work in a super toxic work environment with unlimited workload, therapy won't help. One of the things we do, because we have so many users who give us so much data, we anonymize all of that. Actually, using Kyan is anonymous. You don't need to connect with your corporate email address. You don't need to use your real name. So we manage privacy very well. But then we're able to get meta-level data across functions, business units, countries, regions, at a very granular level, and we're able to state things like, in finance, accounts receivable, sub-function in Poland, there's issues with burnout because of conflict, right? In Egypt, people are leaving the company voluntarily because of workload, right? So we can be extremely specific with our clients to say, hey, if you want to reduce voluntary attrition in Egypt, we need to provide, a program on delegation, right? Or on, strategic workforce planning, right? Here's 3 things that we could do together. In Poland, it's about nonviolent communication, right? And that's when it becomes more specific, because otherwise, companies don't need another resilience workshop, sorry to say, but that doesn't really solve anything. We need specific actions for the things that make people go on sick leave and leave the company. This sort of transparency is created through what we call Kyan Enterprise. It's a set of people analytics dashboards that allow any HR leader or well-being leader to understand what's really going on. And then the third pillar is addressing part of these challenges. So we have Kyan Academy, which allows us to deliver these really targeted programs, addressing communication problems, workload, and so on. And then, of course, we also advise them on policies, on things that they can put in place to reduce these programs.
I like it because it's a system-level approach to a systemic problem, not just go to therapy, go meditate, you fix yourself, which is unfortunately often our default.
Yeah, and those are really important things. I think it's not either or. Ideally, it's both.
Of course,
people need to have access to their own, resilience solutions, right? Be it therapy or coaching or whatever works for them. But it's really not enough. And as an organization, your interest is to have high-performing teams. So you really have to do the other part too.
You've been a leader in high-pressure environments. You are one now. You have to answer to a lot of people. There's a lot of money and people's lives at well-being at stake. What's your advice to other leaders like yourself who want to do right by their people but feel they don't know where to start, right? Or, there's so much pressure, it's easier just to keep going. What's your advice?
So I think, I guess I'd go back to the point I made earlier about you feel pressure no matter what. If you're on the beach for 2 years, you're going to feel pressure to not be on the beach and do something else. When I was in McKinsey, I was feeling pressure to make everybody happy and the deck to be perfect and the client to be happy all the time. In my role as the CEO and founder of Kyan, I have pressure from investors and from our clients and, to keep our people happy and so on. But the perceived pressure that I feel in this environment now is a lot lower, or at least a lot healthier than what I felt earlier. So my advice is to choose your pressure, to figure out what environment do you really thrive in and what pressure do you feel motivated to deal with and to handle. Leaving aside the intensity of the pressure, right? If sort of workload is too high and so on, those things can change what I'm saying. But try to find the right topic to work on or the right environment to work on that topic that gives you an equal amount of energy to deal with the pressure that you're under. And I think when you do that, you can actually deal with a lot more pressure, a lot more responsibility than if you're in an environment where, you're actually not getting any energy from the stuff you're working on. right? And I guess this is what any entrepreneur would say, right? Because they're so passionate about the topic they're working on. But for me, that made a huge difference. I felt I was able to handle things a lot better and get a lot more energy out of the work I'm doing when I found a topic that I was really passionate about because of the personal experience I had with, going through this stuff myself.
Say more about the perceived pressure. What is that? What does that feel like?
Yeah, I mean, maybe to use a silly analogy, right? Waiting times, right? You could, there was this interesting study done in New York, which counted the number of complaints that people have, to the building management about how long it takes for the elevator to reach the ground floor.
Yes.
And so they invested millions of dollars of increasing the speed of the elevator really marginally by, making the stop shorter between floors and so on. And the complaints didn't drop, right? And then all of a sudden they just put a mirror, on the ground floor. So while people were waiting, they could, check themselves out, watch themselves, while they were waiting for the elevator. And the complaints dropped almost zero, right? Because the experience that you have when you're under pressure, in this case, waiting for the elevator to come, had changed completely, right? The focus was on something they actually enjoyed, looking at themselves before they go to work, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, the waiting time is the same, right? You'll always have high expectations. To bring it back to our example, be it in consulting or in entrepreneurship, you'll always have people that ask you for reports, and you have to deliver results no matter what. But doing it in a way that you enjoy and find energy from reduces how that pressure really feels to you, right? And I think we often just jump at opportunities and things without actually asking ourselves the question, hey, how will I actually feel when I'm doing that, right? What's going to give me enough energy from it?
Yes.
And for me, doing something that I felt personally connected to because of my experience made a huge difference. That was a bit like putting the mirror, in the ground floor and really, reducing the perceived pressure.
Right, because the reality of your pressure to deliver hasn't changed.
If anything, it's probably
Worse.
much higher, right? I think, I would definitely not want to, let down one of our clients or, one of our investors. We have a much larger team than I ever had at McKinsey now in Kyan. But because of the work that we do, I just, feel a lot more energized doing it. And therefore the pressure that I feel, it's a bit different.
So I'm a words person, and in my day job, I help clients build marketing campaigns and sales campaigns that use narratives, that use stories, that use words that work. And so when I'm meeting with a client, I'll always say to them, what are the words that close? What are the words that makes that client's eyes light up and think, oh yeah, I need to do this? And I'm curious, from your experience, you said in previously that interest was a word. What are the words that work?
So, and I don't think this is the perfect word yet. I think there's a lot more sort of one word equity discussions you and I could have about finding that right word. But we've done part of this work when creating our pitch deck for the latest funding round, right? And one of the things we found works very well with both our investors and clients ultimately is unlocking. It's about unlocking something that we all have within us, this sense of productivity, joy, performance at work, but that's somehow hampered by the way we do things. And the data really backs that up. I mean, you mentioned it as well. Mental health is the number one reason why people go on sick leave, and it actually costs about 1 day per work week, right? So think about it. We have a 5-day work week. 1 day goes to waste because of poor mental health at work, according to a study made by Vitality in the UK. And if you could unlock that, we could actually have a 4-day work week for the same amount of time that people work today, right? So we could get an extra day of the weekend. And the flip side of that is, we'll never have a 4-day work week while we are wasting so much human potential, right? So unlocking that extra productivity, extra joy in doing the work can really create a better environment for both the employer and the employee, right? If we only learn how to do that effectively and create an environment where, people work better. And we've already done it for machines, right? We have all of these tools that allow us to track performance and, do planned maintenance when we need to so that our machines don't break down all the time. We haven't done it yet for people. And it's a very simplistic metaphor, but I think the sense of we can unlock our potential, we can do a lot more with what we have, and therefore, have more leisure time or also, increase the output of a company, I think resonates very well with our clients.
That's it for this episode of The Anxious Achiever. The show is produced and edited by Mary Dew with production support and sound engineering by Nick Krinko. If you like what you heard, head to your favorite podcast app, leave us a review. It really matters, and we appreciate the time and effort it takes. And if you don't subscribe or follow the show already, now's the time. And let us know what you'd like to hear more of. I get some of my best ideas from my listeners, so find me on LinkedIn, send me a message. You can find my weekly newsletter there as well. A big thanks to LinkedIn and all the listeners out there and our guests in the Anxious Achiever world. Until next time.